I would like to start by saying that all the names in this story have been changed. Last year in 2021, I was living in a townhouse in New Mexico with my twin sister, we'll call her Carrie, and our two childhood best friends, Robbie and Izzy. The time in that house was full of your typical young adult ups and downs, but amplified by the turmoil of the pandemic. That house was full of good, bad, and ugly times, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. However, the last few months were absolutely terrible before I ended up leaving the state. Let me start with a little backstory. Carrie had been in a relationship with a man who we will call Jay. Jay and Carrie had a very unhealthy relationship, which ended with him being kicked out of our house after an altercation between him and Carrie. Police were called, and we thought that would be the end of it. Let's just say he didn't take being thrown out of the house and dumped too well. One day, on the off chance that I had a day off from work, I was in the kitchen most of the day doing some deep cleaning and self care. While I was able to do the first part with ease, I could not for the life of me shake the feeling of being watched. I have struggled with anxiety symptoms due to PTSD, so I wrote this off as me just having a bad day. That was until Robbie came home, throwing the door open and shouting, "Tell me why I saw Jay circling our block." I was in shock. I ran to the window looking over our street, and sure enough, Jay's car was speeding off. We told Carrie about it as soon as she got home from work that day, and she then revealed to myself, Robbie, and Ozzy that Jay had been stalking her. I was not surprised given the details of this situation, as Carrie then told us about this next situation, which shook me to my core. One night, I want to say this story was about 2 weeks prior to him circling the block. Jay had been watching Carrie from afar while she went out with friends. Carrie must have forgot to lock the door when she came home. She says she woke up from a deep sleep and could have sworn that she saw someone standing over her bed. She said she didn't want to tell us right away because she had first assumed that she was dreaming or even having an episode of sleep paralysis. She would later receive a message from Jay scolding her for not talking to him when he came to the house the other night. That other night in question being the same night. Carrie had come home. I started locking the doors even when everyone was home after Carrie told me that story. He was in the house while we were all sleeping sound in our beds, unaware that someone who we all didn't want anywhere near us was just sulking in the corner of my sister's bedroom. Watching over her, he could have done anything, but he chose to just watch her. That was deeply unsettling for all of us. Now I had already made the decision that once my lease was over, I was going to be moving in with my partner in a different state. At this point, we had all been packing up our things and preparing to move, go our separate ways. For more context, the landlord had installed a security system. Nothing high tech by any means, but anytime a door or window was open, the alarm would say it in a robotic monotone voice: side door open or back office window closed. Things like that. One night I was home alone. Carrie was at dinner with Robbie and Rowdy's mom, and I had no idea where Izzy was until this series of events happened. I was in my bedroom when suddenly I heard what sounded like tapping on my window. I figured it was the branches tapping like they usually did when there was even a small gust of wind, but the tapping was constant, timed almost. I still shrugged it off again and trying not to make myself anxious while I was alone in the house. It was then that I heard the security system go off, back sliding door open from the other room. Weird. We all usually come in through the side door when the kitchen and living room meet, as our front door was next to impossible to open from the outside. I brushed it off thinking, maybe Carrie and Robbie had forgotten their keys and just came in through the back door. I called out from my bedroom, Carrie. Robbie, how was dinner? No response. As soon as the words left my mouth, the silence was deafening. I walked out to the hallways where all of the bedrooms led and called out again, Carrie. Robbie? Azzy. Again, nothing. I'm getting a bit freaked out now, but I'm thinking that they didn't hear me, but that silence. I will never in my life forget the silence that rang through the house as I inched closer to the living room. As I am finally standing in the living room, the only sounds I had heard in the span of a few minutes was my own heart beating out of my chest, my footsteps, and the AC kicking on. I finally reached the living room and I had checked Find My Friends. To my horror, Carrie and Rowdy were still at the restaurant with Rowdy's mom, Izzy's. Phone had broken during this time too, so I had no clue where she was still. Knowing what I know at that moment, I called out one last time, but I couldn't bring myself to turn the corner and go into the kitchen. Azzy, are you home? Silence again. I figured maybe I was just hearing things at that point. Then I heard it. Came a hushed whisper from the kitchen. followed by the most hurried footsteps behind me, going out the back door. I froze. Who was that? It all made sense at that point. The tapping on the window, the door opening with no noise from whoever opened it, and now this. I knew at that moment that I was not alone. Something came over me and I snapped out of this frozen reaction. You better get out of my house. I screamed at the top of my lungs. I grabbed the baseball bat that I kept in the hall closet and started shouting that same sentence in 10 different ways, opening all the doors and switching on all the lights, making sure that whoever this was had left. I finally made it to the kitchen and found out the sliding glass door was left wide open by whoever came into it. As soon as the adrenaline had worn off, the shock then set in. I booked it out of the house, locking the doors before throwing open my car door and ripping out the driveway without putting on my seatbelt. I called all my roommates, whose phones still worked. I later found out that Izzy had actually left town for the weekend and I had missed that conversation. So I know whoever was in the house was not my sister or either of my other two roommates. Robbie called the police as soon as we got off the phone. Of course, there wasn't much they could do because nothing was stolen and I didn't see who was in my home uninvited. I drove to my coworker's house and I broke down telling her what happened and then I waited for her to update me on what she and Carrie were going to do. They opted to stay at the hotel with Robbie's mom that night. I don't know who it was that broke into my house that night. Was it Jay? Some drunk college kid who stumbled into our yard thinking it was their place. Someone with more sinister intentions who got caught at the right time. I am not sure. I think that is what keeps me up sometimes when I think too deeply about that night. I know it wasn't an anxiety-induced thing. I saw the door and I heard the whisper at the footsteps hurrying out the same door they came in. I am just happy that I live with my partner in a different state now in a relatively safe neighborhood. But even that, some nights is not enough to allow me to feel safe when I am home alone. I grew up in a small town. My mother worked two jobs to support us financially. When I was 7 years old, my dad left my mom and never came back, and my brother, unfortunately, has autism. Unlike others, he is actually a bit better in his condition, though he rarely talks or expresses like a normal person, but he can do his basic chores. Most of the day, he sits near the window and watches the world outside. This incident happened when I was 15 years old and my brother Jack was 11. My mom was working a night shift on a Thursday, so basically it was just me and my brother. We were kind of used to staying on our own at night because we had no other choice. Our neighbor next door was an alcoholic man. He had a son close to my age, but we often heard the man screaming at his son late at night. This particular night, I was sitting in our living room and watching TV. My brother was upstairs lying on his bed. Suddenly, I heard huge chaos outside. I opened the door and saw 3 or 4 people had gathered in front of our neighbor's house. Within 5 to 7 minutes, a cop arrived, and they sealed the entire house within seconds. Paramedics even came out and took a body on a stretcher, and behind them I saw the father getting into an ambulance with a bleeding head. At first, I couldn't understand what was going on, but after hearing the conversations of the people gathering in front of the scene, it gave me a clear idea of what just happened. The father reported to 911 saying a homeless man broke into their house and tried to rob them. He hit the father with a baseball bat and badly injured him, as the father was already drunk. He fell to the floor in terrible pain. The father saw the son rushing towards the man to stop him. That was just when the man hit his son on the back of the head and he fell to the floor. The man then stole his wallet, had a few electronics, and escaped the premises. The cops registered the father's complaint, but after suffering a huge blood clotting inside the brain, his son died in the hospital that night. Our entire town was shook in fear. No one expected such a terrible tragedy. The father arranged a small funeral for his son, and we attended. Everyone paid their condolences to him. The local sheriff assured him that they would find the guy who destroyed his family. My mom got utterly terrified and asked our grandma to watch us during our night shifts. Our neighbor, Mr. Feynman, had changed after his son's death. I often saw him sitting on the porch with a terrified face. I could tell that he was suffering the trauma of that night. Every single second. I mean, no doubt it would have been horrifying to watch your son dying on the floor at the hands of an intruder and not being able to do anything. Mr. Feynman stopped drinking after that incident. He pleaded with the sheriff to let him move out as he was traumatized to live in that house, but the ongoing investigation compelled him to stay back. About a week after the incident, I started to notice some weird behavior in my brother. Even though we never discussed the death of the boy next door, I'm sure my brother must have realized something happened to our neighbors. One day, I was doing my schoolwork sitting in the living room. It was a boring, rainy afternoon. Jack was sitting next to the living room window and watching the raindrops. Suddenly, I heard him chuckle. I looked at him and saw he was looking outside and laughing at something. The street and neighboring houses were visible from that window. I asked him, "What's so funny, Jack?" He chuckled and said, "Him," and pointed out the window. I immediately got up and walked towards the window. I stood next to my brother and looked out. Like I said, it was raining outside. The rain wasn't that heavy, which is why I could see the empty street clearly. As far as my eyes went, I didn't see a single living creature outside. I thought to myself, Jack was probably imagining something, and I laughed at it. That night, when we all sat for dinner, Jack surprised all of us. My mom served him some food and placed the plate in front of him to eat, but Jack got up and slowly went to the kitchen. He then brought an extra plate and placed it on the table right beside him. "Why did you bring an extra plate?" My mom said. He looked beside him as if someone was actually sitting on the chair next to him and smiled on his own. I was feeling very odd about his behavior. I said, "Jack, Mom is asking you something." He then looked at our mom and said, "He's hungry, Mom." "Serve him too, he's hungry." My mom and I were absolutely stunned by Jack's behavior. My mom replied in a low, calm voice, "Who is he?" Jack chuckled and said, "My friend William." We just thought that like every normal kid, Jack had an imaginary friend. So that night, we didn't react to his sudden weird behavior, as he seemed happy, so we decided to play along with this. Jack often talked and smiled on his own. Whenever someone asked, he said he was talking to his friend William. Things never took a different turn, so Jack's behavior never worried me that way. That was until one night when I woke up in my room and heard footsteps going down the stairs. Now my mom slept downstairs while my brother and I had a room upstairs. I got up from my bed and went to check on my brother. As I opened his bedroom door, I saw it was empty. I rushed downstairs and found the main door wide open. I freaked out and woke up my mom. We came out of the house and started calling for my brother. My mom was about to cry when we heard a chuckling sound coming from our backyard. We ran there and saw Jack standing under a tree. He was facing his back at us. I said in a broken voice, "Jackie, are you all right?" He suddenly turned towards us. I had never seen my brother like this. His eyes were blood red and his face was filled with pain. He said in a rough voice, "He's buried here," and then fainted on the ground. My brother caught a high fever the next morning. We called many doctors, but no one could tell exactly what was wrong with him. My mom became tense and worried. She hardly slept at night. One night, I saw my mom talking to our town sheriff standing at the doorway. After the sheriff left, I asked my mom what he was saying. My mom replied that the sheriff was going to close the next door neighbor's case file. They investigated a lot, but couldn't get a hold of the intruder who broke into their house that night. Suddenly, my eyes widened. I asked my mom, what was the name of Mr. Feynman's son? She replied, I think it was William. Why do you ask? My head started to throb in fear. Is this possible? All this time, the imaginary friend my brother was talking about was none other than our neighbor's dead son. I rushed to Jack's room. He was muttering something in his sleep. I got close to him and said, Jack, is William right here with you now? You're just going to have to trust me. I'm not making this up at all. My brother suddenly opened his eyes and looked at the corner of the room. As I followed his eyes, my heart sunk in fear. A teenage boy was standing in the darkness of the corner of the room. His eyes were pale white with small pupils gushing out of them. His face was particularly visible as his entire body was in the darkness. Dried blood spots were visible on his left cheek and forehead. He then looked at me and my brother. Jackie got out of his bed slowly and then started to walk out of the room. I followed him downstairs. My mom was sitting in the living room. Suddenly seeing Jack walking on his own amidst this fever, she rushed to him. But before she could do anything else, I stopped her and told her everything. My mom and I came out of the house following Jack. Jack walked towards the backyard and stopped right in front of the tree. This tree was standing in the middle of our backyard and the backyard of our neighbor, Mr. Feynman. Jack then pointed towards the ground beneath the tree and said, "Dead here," and then fainted to the ground. Without wasting a single second, I told my mom to call our sheriff. She did right away and came with 3 other police officers. People in our neighborhood gathered in our backyard out of curiosity. In front of everyone, the cops dug under the tree. What they found still disturbs me to this day. They found a bloody baseball bat wrapped in a bloody cloth buried under the tree. The mystery unfolded, shocking our town once again. Mr. Feynman murdered his own son out of a fit of drunkenness. But to save himself from the law, he decided to make up the entire story of the robbery. He injured himself, willing to make the situation more believable, and even secretly buried the murder weapon. Without the murder weapon, no cops would have ever caught this man. That must have been why he wanted to move out so bad. The cops arrested him that day and took him into custody. Surprisingly, my brother Jack got completely better the very next day. We still live in that house, and I believe William has finally been able to rest in peace. During the spring of 2004, I was 19 even though I looked about 14. I was 5 foot nothing and weighed about 100 pounds as if I was carrying laundry. My parents and aunt were vacationing in Mexico. I had decided to opt out and house sit for my aunt. I figured it would be a nice opportunity to have a quiet place to study for my upcoming exams, and all I really had to do was clean the pool, collect the mail, and restock the fridge with groceries. I also had a plan of action that involved emptying her safe and rescuing her car in the event of wildfires. Her place was high up in the hills of Southern California with a terrific view of Long Beach. I mostly spent my time in the massage chair in the guest bedroom playing music in the background while I pored over my psychology notes. Occasionally, I would sit out on the balcony and work on my tan or use the treadmill in the basement, but I mostly was secluded in the air conditioning trying to be productive. Every night, I would set the alarm and make sure the security cameras were working. Before I went to bed, but on the fourth night of my stay, I was really focused on the books and forgot to set the alarm after it got dark. At about 1:30 a.m., I paused to take a break. That's when I realized how late it was. My stomach sank as I remembered that the basement door was unlocked and I had to secure it before setting the alarm. Before heading downstairs, I wandered into the study to get a look at the security cameras just to be safe. I remembered thinking to myself, what are the chances that someone may actually be inside the house? As soon as I finished processing that thought, I saw the figure on the basement stairs. I remembered my mouth falling open and making a small croaking sound. There was a middle-aged balding man with glasses slowly making his way up the stairs, and to make the situation even more unnerving, in one of his hands he was holding a balloon. I stared at the cameras as he reached the top of the basement stairs and looked around before cautiously setting foot into the kitchen. My first thought was to slam the door, lock it, and call the cops, but deep down I knew it would take the police between 10 and 12 minutes just to make it out here, and in that time this guy could easily overpower me and drag me into the night. I suppose I could have hidden somewhere as well, but I didn't like the idea of trying to stay quiet while he wandered from room to room searching for me. Instead, I decided to go on the offensive and try something, and it was both incredibly daring and amazingly stupid. I tiptoed back into my room, turned up the music, and then made a loud production of exiting the room, pounding my feet down the hall. I called out as loud as possible, "Marcus, I swear I heard something downstairs. Put on your shirt," and grabbed the key to the gun cabinet. I was positive my voice was quivering as I said it, but I figured the music playing in the background would hide that fact well enough. I paused for a few seconds waiting to see if he would call my bluff, but when all I heard was the silence from down below, I power walked back into the study, locked the door, and checked the cameras. Sure enough, he was scampering out of the basement door like a frightened squirrel. I watched him run across the backyard around the pool and disappear between the hedges. As soon as he was clear of the house, he let go of the balloon, and I watched it from my window as it lazily flittered away towards the Pacific. I ran downstairs, locked the basement door, set the alarm, and called the cops. I also called my parents and aunt and told them what happened, asking them how I could rewind it to show the police. My aunt asked me why I didn't just hit the panic alarm on the security pad, and I had to admit that I hadn't even thought of that. To make a long story short, the police caught the guy a week later. He was sleeping in his car in the grocery store parking lot. Everyone always asked me what I thought the balloon was all about and if I had to guess. I think it was a gift. This guy must have seen me a few times outside the house, surmised that I was alone, and assumed I was much younger than I really was. I have no idea if the guy is still in prison, but regardless of where he is, I kind of hope he hears this and feels stupid. He got scared away by nothing but the empty threat of a panicked girl with the strength of a malnourished gerbil. Back in May of 2010, while in desperate need of cash, I agreed to house sit for one of my old high school teachers. He had contacted me via Facebook and asked me if I would be willing to water his plants, collect his mail, and clean up the place while he went out of town for a couple of days. He didn't specify where he was going, but he agreed to pay me $400 for 2.5 days with half up front, so I agreed. I never really liked him in high school. He was teaching classic literature, and he always seemed to enjoy pointing out any illustrations that in any way featured nudity. His eyes always seemed hungry, and he tended to wheeze like he was out of breath, even though he was kind of a small guy. My friends and I used to refer to him as Mr. Lip Tit. When I arrived at his place, the key was beneath the mat and $200 were in an envelope on the kitchen table. I turned on my music, watered the plants, cleaned and vacuumed the ground floor, and made myself dinner. I found his house to be extremely boring. It was filled with old books, stacks of newspapers, and ancient-looking furniture that didn't really look comfortable to sit in. I settled into my sleeping bag on the guest bed, but I had a hard time staying asleep. It seemed that every 5 minutes there was another strange noise coming from the house, and it would put me on edge. The following morning I went back to my own house, had breakfast, and took a shower before coming back and cleaning the second floor. Upon entering the guest bedroom, there was the faint smell of something in the air that definitely had not been there before. And what's more, I could have sworn that my sleeping bag was in a slightly different position when I had left it that morning. I started getting a bad vibe. I decided that night that I would sleep downstairs in the living room. I finished cleaning just after 10 p.m. I made some popcorn and enjoyed some cable TV, which I didn't have at my place. Around 11, I shut off the TV, wrapped myself up in my sleeping bag, and tried to drift off. I was tossing and turning for a bit, and just as I began to doze off, there came a click of the doorknob turning in the other room. I glanced over, and I swear by any god you choose, Mr. Liptak emerged from the pantry wearing only his socks. He then slowly turned the corner and made his way upstairs. I grabbed my phone and my keys and exited out the back door quietly. I ran around front to get into my car and sped home, where I immediately called the cops. I didn't know exactly how to explain the situation to them. I mean, he wasn't breaking and entering. It was his house. But when I explained to the operator that he had deceived me into thinking that he was gone, they sent out a patrol car. I had to collect the stuff that I had left at his house anyway. When the police arrived, Mr. Liptak answered the door wearing my sleeping bag over his shoulders. The police discovered a butler's cupboard, which was a secret room in the pantry that I wasn't aware of, where he had been hiding with a digital camera. He had taken a few dozen photos of me all around the house, most of which when I was sleeping. I showed the police the Facebook messages he sent me, assuring me that he would be out of town, and they arrested him. I collected all my remaining stuff but left the sleeping bag. I didn't waste any time getting a restraining order against him. Mr. Licktack made bail, but actually died of a heart attack a few weeks later after being rear-ended in his car at a stoplight. I never got the rest of my money.